Meet someone like you. Let's call her Alex. Her job was mostly forms, follow-ups, and spreadsheets. Then the company bought software that did it in minutes. Overnight, Alex wasn't lazy or unskilled, she was replaceable. Confronting Capitalism says this happens whenever routine work meets technology. But it also says opportunity grows where people can translate problems into systems and service. Alex didn't need a new personality. She needed a skill map, what to learn next, where to apply it this week, and how to prove it with tiny, visible wins on real tasks. A map that turns scattered effort into momentum, fuses tech with human strengths, and puts her where new demand rises, not where old tasks die. Chapter 1. The persistence of poverty. Imagine waking up every morning to a question that gnaws at your conscience. Why? In a world brimming with wealth, does poverty still cling to millions like a second skin? It's the kind of puzzle that's not just academic, it's personal. You look around your neighborhood, or maybe your city, and you see signs of affluence. Luxury cars, boutique cafes, families planning holidays halfway around the world. And then, in the same breath, you pass someone sleeping rough on the pavement or a family juggling 2 jobs just to afford groceries. That contradiction, it's the opening scene of our mystery. Now, you might think poverty is just about not having enough money. But here's the first twist in our case. Poverty is sticky. Even as the world economy grows and technology races ahead, the number of people trapped in extreme poverty barely budges in some places. It's not just a money issue, it's a systemic flaw. Think of the global economy as a game of Monopoly. At the start, some players get extra properties, free passes, and a pile of cash, while others begin with almost nothing. The rules may look fair on paper, but in practice, the dice are loaded. So how did we get here? Well, a big clue lies in the structure of capitalism itself. While capitalism has lifted millions out of poverty, it's also great at concentrating wealth, especially in the hands of those who already have it. It rewards efficiency and innovation, yes, but it also lets the strong dominate the weak, often without a referee on the field. Let's follow the trail further. In many developing countries, the economic engine simply doesn't fire on all cylinders. There's corruption, weak governance, lack of education, and fragile institutions. All of these are potholes in the road to prosperity. Even when foreign investments pour in, they often extract more value than they add locally, like a gold prospector leaving behind a scarred mountain. But here's another twist. Poverty isn't confined to far-off places. In the world's richest nations, it wears a different mask homeless veterans single mothers. Picture us standing at the edge of a crowded city alley, listening for the faint heartbeat of a mystery that refuses to die, asking why so many people still lack the basics of a decent life. I start with a simple, unsettling question you can feel in your gut, not just understand with your head, which is why poverty clings so tightly when our world clearly has enough knowledge and resources to loosen its grip. For billions, each day is a marathon with no finish line, all sweat and no medals, where hunger steals energy. Illness stalks bodies without doctors, and schooling is a dream deferred until survival stops consuming every waking hour. We once shrugged and called poverty inevitable, like bad weather that arrives every season. But factories drew peasants into cities. Slums grew like weeds, and writers began holding up mirrors that made everyone face what they preferred to ignore. Over time, governments and civic groups tried different antidotes, from shelters and clinics to income supports and tax credits, all meant to keep families afloat long enough to swim towards sturdier ground rather than sink quietly beneath the surface. The global community set shared targets, promising to cut extreme deprivation and expand basic education and health. Yet wars, recessions, rising costs, and fragile institutions kept bumping people off the narrow bridge that was supposed to carry them forward. So the detective work begins by asking what truly drives poverty, because our remedies depend on whether we blame personal choices, runaway population growth, missing property rights, or the capture of a nation's wealth by a narrow ruling circle. Some say the poor fell through by ignoring school-forming households, too early chasing short-term comforts, and relying on assistance rather than low-wage jobs. Yet many would gladly take steady work and safe housing if doors opened when they knocked. Another view points to family size outpacing family means, reminding us land and water are finite, crops strain under heat and drought, and a planet cannot feed mouths without smarter farming, fewer births, or both working together over time. A stark policy experiment limited births in one large country, preventing a vast number of arrivals and easing pressure on food and income for many families, though at a human cost and with exceptions that left difficult ethical questions behind. A different lens stares at the paperwork drawer and notices assets that cannot be used as collateral. Because homes lack clear titles, businesses operate informally, and property exists in a twilight zone where banks refuse to recognize value there. When ownership is murky, capital sleeps like treasure locked in a chest without a key. Entrepreneurs cannot borrow, insure, or invest. And the staircase from poverty becomes a wall without steps, no matter how willing the climber may be. Then there is the argument that growth without justice is a hollow victory because a nation, as income can swell while living standards for ordinary families shrink when elites capture the spoils, redirect support, and fence off opportunity behind polished gates. Think of places where oil or minerals leave the ground fast, but value-added skills never take root, and money flows to well-connected hands while schools, clinics, and small firms wait in line watching development lag as official numbers celebrate expansion. Blame falls on politics that close windows instead of opening doors because one party, rule weak courts and muzzle media let cronies prosper while dissenters are sidelined, and inequality widens into a fault line that shakes every attempt at shared progress. Some neighbors of such regimes pick up arms, others try to leave, and commerce withers as fear replaces trust, proving how hard it is to build household security when a national house sits on foundations cracked by corruption and exclusion. From a wider angle, several traps spring shut again and again, including conflict that swallows young men with no prospects, dependence on commodities that invites corruption, landlocked borders that throttle trade, and leaders who treat the state like an estate. Each trap suggests a distinct tool, whether peacekeeping that truly protects civilians, training, and industries that add value before exporting, roads to ports across friendlier borders, or reforms that make public power answerable to law instead of family loyalty. Aid enters the story like a visiting doctor, and we argue over whether to write bigger prescriptions or start by listening carefully, because large programs sometimes miss local realities while smaller efforts, done well, can match remedies to real needs. One camp says generosity can end extreme deprivation if scaled and managed wisely, while another camp warns big plans leak through layers of bureaucracy and underestimate how much dignity and knowledge live inside the communities we hope to help. I have learned that planning from the top must meet initiative from the bottom, the valley drafting its own blueprint, because villages and neighborhoods know their priorities, and small targeted projects deliver clean water, passable roads, and reliable clinics faster. Business has a place at this table, not only through charity, but by treating low-income families as customers and producers, tailoring products, credit, and distribution so people can solve problems themselves and build resilience with each transaction that respects their agency. Turn the lens toward my own country, and the picture is still troubling. Because the share of households struggling rose during hard years, millions fell below official thresholds, and many children carried the heaviest burdens in communities already stretched thin. We debate the arithmetic of hardship when poor families own televisions and phones, but the real pressure comes from tuition, healthcare, childcare, fuel, and rent, which can chew through paychecks faster than falling prices for gadgets can possibly compensate. Households bridge commitment gaps with costly loans, pile up debts that haunt futures, and sell valuables to keep lights on, while a patchwork of programs, food support, medical coverage, housing vouchers, tax credits catches some, yet leaves others clinging to the ledge. Raising pay floors would help many breathe easier, as would creating more good jobs, upgrading skills, and asking top earners to contribute more to the shared systems that make opportunity possible, though political stalemate turns obvious repairs into contested battlegrounds. When I weigh competing strategies, I keep coming back to partnerships that break government capacity, private innovation, and civic trust, because no sector can carry this weight, and alignment matters as much as funding if we want results that last. Another underused tool is the craft of social marketing, the careful planning and measurement of behavior change that public health knows well, applied to savings habits, school attendance, clinic visits, and household decisions that ripple across generations when nudged consistently. We should also consider a floor under everyone's income, replacing confusing layers of assistance with a clear guarantee, letting people plan, work, and save without fearing that a small raise will yank away lifelines they need to keep going forward. At the human level, the story circles to energy and hope, because people cannot invest in tomorrow when today's hunger saps strength. And they cannot hear advice about budgeting or schooling when roof leaks or the medicine cabinet stands empty. Poverty is not a single villain wearing a clear mask, but a crowd of suspects moving in the same dim hallway. And cracking the case means identifying which ones dominate in each place and confronting them in the right order. Some communities need clean titles and efficient registries. Others need conflict resolved and markets open, while many need schools staffed, clinics stocked, and wages lifted. And the strongest progress happens when actions reinforce each other instead of colliding midstream. We also need to be honest about trade-offs, because limiting family size raises questions about autonomy, and directing aid through government's risks capture. Yet doing nothing is itself a choice that reappoints suffering as the default manager of daily life. When institutions are fair, growth becomes development, not bigger numbers. And families move from coping to building, which is what the ideal of a market economy promises when matched with transparency, accountability, and straightforward way to turn effort into mobility. I think of poverty as a leak in the boat all of us share, because water entering one compartment spreads, raising costs for courts, hospitals, and prisons, and draining the trust that commerce and community both need to function well. The private sector can lead here by paying wages that support life rather than survival, pricing externalities into decisions, and seeing underserved communities as partners, not just markets, while public leaders provide the rules and infrastructure that let fairness compound. Civic organizations translate systems into human terms, walking the last mile where policy meets household, building habits, trust, and feedback loops, and reminding us that change takes time, especially when history and hardship have hardened into habits that feel immovable. No single speech or program ends this mystery, yet I stubbornly believe it can be solved because we have enough experience to avoid dead ends, enough tools to adapt solutions, and enough moral imagination to widen our circle of concern. When we reduce the noise of arguments, a consensus appears, saying that dignity requires both income and agency, that safety nets should catch without trapping, and that every child deserves a starting line that is not already behind the curve. The work is to move from scattered pilots to sustained systems, from heroic exceptions to reliable patterns, and from seasonal compassion to structural fairness, which is less glamorous but more powerful than any headline or ribbon cutting could ever be. You and I may disagree about tactics, but we both know the ache of wasted potential, the heaviness of families planning around fear instead of hope, and the stubborn desire to measure success by lives stabilized rather than spreadsheets satisfied. I keep coming back to a picture of a crowded bus climbing a steep hill, where some passengers hang from the outside because seats inside were taken ago, and our test is whether we pull them aboard or keep driving. The good news is that pulling them aboard strengthens the engine rather than slowing it, because healthier, educated, and secure families buy, work, invent, and contribute, which is the reliable energy source any economy can find when growth needs fuel. We know this from places and periods where smart interventions multiply gains, and from neighborhoods where small investments set off long chains of improvement, proving that progress is less about miracles and more about steady hand steering with clear priorities. Poverty will persist where cynicism tells the story, but it recedes where pragmatism and empathy share the microphone. and where leaders treat at the margins as protagonists rather than statistics waiting to be filed away after the cameras turn off. As an investigator who still believes cases can be closed, I carry forward what works, discard what distracts, and keep knocking on doors that say private, because the answers usually hide where accountability has been postponed the longest. The call, then, is simple and demanding: to aim for fewer hungry nights, predictable paychecks, safer streets, stronger schools, clearer titles, and clinics within reach, stitched together so families feel the difference in their bones, not just read about it. If we do that with seriousness and patience, we can change the background music of daily life from anxious to hopeful, which is the important soundtrack a society can play when it wants better choices to multiply on their own. You might ask whether this stretches budgets or politics, and I would answer that societies already pay for poverty through emergencies, prisons, and lost potential, so rebalancing toward prevention is not extravagance. It is fiscal common sense wearing a human face. Solving poverty is not charity draped in new language. It is maintenance on the engine that moves us all. And the wisest societies treat maintenance as their first spending priority rather than their last-minute scramble after the breakdown begins. I will not pretend this is easy, yet I refuse to accept that difficulty equals impossibility, because every statistic hides a person who will stand taller if the system meets them halfway, and that should be motivation enough to keep going. Now keep that question alive as we turn to the next corridor, where the trail leads from empty plates to uneven paychecks. And the puzzle shifts from survival to fairness, because distribution shapes destiny when production gets the loudest applause. I lean toward you like a detective sliding a fresh file across the desk and whisper, "The case has a new lead, not about poverty this time, but about why the money trail keeps veering upward." We were promised that growth would overflow like soup from a too-full bowl, yet the spill seems to land mostly in the laps of those already seated near the head of the table. The story says prosperity trickles down, but the clues point to something different, with gains climbing like balloons in a staircase, while wages for many drift sideways, like leaves stuck in a quiet eddy. Influence travels where money gathers, so rules and loopholes bend like reeds in a strong wind, letting investment income face gentler taxes, while regular paychecks shoulder heavier packs up the same steep hill. When I lay Piketty's chart on the table, the line that matters compares what wealth returns earn to how fast the whole economy expands. And lately, the former has outrun the latter like a sprinter chasing daylight. During a rare stretch last century, growth beat returns and ordinary households climbed, but in recent decades, returns have reclaimed the lead, turning inequality from a background hum into the loud drumbeat guiding the procession. Wealth now towers over yearly incomes like a high-rise overshadowing a bungalow, because the stock of assets has swelled faster than paychecks, making those who own capital feel the sun while wage earners watch shadows lengthen. Boards set executive rewards by glancing sideways rather than downward, benchmarking against other titans, ratcheting packages higher each season, until compensation looks less like pay for performance and more like a ladder only extending at the penthouse. Meanwhile, a different corner of finance writes checks that dwarf salaries elsewhere, with hedge fund figures resembling lottery wins repeated annually, raising the question of whether markets measure contribution or simply reward strategic proximity to money's fastest currents. Step outside the skyscraper district, and you feel the ladder rungs spread further apart, with the affluent comfortable, the middle class cautious, the working class stretched, and the poor dependent on supports that sometimes fray at the edges. A few statistics land like gavel strikes, reminding us that a tiny fraction holds a vast share of wealth while huge numbers juggle bills. And the spread itself becomes the plot twist that shapes politics, confidence, and everyday choices. Inequality is not just a chart problem. It seeps into family routines like a slow leak, provoking longer work hours, deferred schooling, heavier debts, and the uneasy sense that tomorrow depends more on birthplace than on effort. When wages stall, households backfill with credit cards, the way hikers patch a boot with tape, practical in the moment but dangerous over miles. And the debt pile becomes another cliff between ambition and achievable security. Public budgets try to soften blows, yet assistance often fades amid debate, and redistribution varies widely, with some countries using taxes and transfers to pull inequality down sharply, while others pull less and leave more weight on individual shoulders. Ask people where they would rather live when shown different income ladders without labels, and many choose the version with a tighter gap, revealing an instinct that fairness is not envy, it is social glue keeping neighbors cooperative. Religious voices have even warned about wealth ruling rather than serving, and civic protests have signaled frustration, because a system designed to reward initiative becomes fragile if most initiative fails to secure stable housing, schooling, and health. Even the global elite gathered to discuss a friendlier capitalism, promising to rebuild trust and encourage training, yet shying away from tougher remedies that might truly narrow the gap, preferring persuasion campaigns over deeper resets of incentives and obligations. So what helps without breaking the gears, you ask? And I answer that raising the lowest pay makes floors sturdier, while acknowledging some firms would struggle, and others might automate faster, meaning policy needs patience alongside ambition. A more progressive tax design can lean against runaway inequality, especially when top brackets once ran higher, though designing rates involves trade-offs and politics because growth, investment, and fairness sit around the same crowded table negotiating uneasy compromises. Cleaning up profit shifting and headquarters hopping matters too, because when firms route earnings through low-tax islands or change addresses on paper, public treasuries thin out, and the bill for schools and roads slides quietly toward everyone else. Examples of subsidiaries selling internally and global inversions show how complicated the pathways have become, making reform feel like untangling headphones pulled hastily from a pocket. Necessary work if we want the music to play smoothly. None of this aims to punish success. It aims to keep opportunity believable, because when rungs are reachable, effort feels worthwhile, and when rungs are missing, frustration curdles into cynicism that corrodes markets, communities, and democratic consent. If I sound insistent, it is because inequality behaves like gravity in the plot, pulling other problems into its orbit, from slower growth to frayed trust, and every delay makes the eventual climb steeper for ordinary families. The solutions I favor break government capacity, business responsibility, and community wisdom, not as slogans but as mechanics, because systems change when each gear turns in concert, and monitoring outcomes keeps noble intentions from drifting into comfortable rituals. We have traced the fingerprints across tax codes, compensation committees, household budgets, and offshore ledgers, and the pattern is unmistakable, telling us the mystery is solvable if we choose the mix of courage, patience, and shared purpose. Keep your coat nearby, because the next room turns from distribution to the daily battlefield where paychecks are forged, and we will find workers bracing against headwinds that feel less like weather and more like design. I slide a new folder across our cafe table and say the next puzzle sits not in boardrooms but on factory floors, storefronts, and fields, asking whether the system treats workers as partners or expendable parts. Our question echoes from old ideological battles, because capitalism's defenders celebrate workers, rising living standards, while its critics insist the structure exploits labor and keeps bargaining power permanently tilted toward owners. I walk you through Marx's notion that value grows from workers' time and effort, that capital embodies past labor, and that a narrow group controls production while a reserve of unemployed people keeps wages subdued. History gives us stark scenes from Britain's industrial dawn, with miners laboring endless days, children stuck on lines instead of classrooms, and exhausted bodies aging too fast for a wage barely covering bread and rent. Across the Atlantic, immigrants sweated in crowded shops and migrants bent over crops for pennies, filling novels and news with evidence that exploitation stood not on the margins, but at the center of everyday labor. Remember the meatpacking exposed that revealed workplaces unsafe and lives precarious, and the dust-choked journey of a dispossessed family seeking harvest work only to find meager pay vanishing when seasons closed their doors. Abuse did not disappear, as farm crews in scorching fields faced harassment, denial of breaks, and coercion, pulling back the curtain on practices so degrading you could feel the heat and indignity rising from every paragraph. Globally, millions still labor under arrangements resembling bondage, with debts, forced work, and trafficking chaining hope to contracts that never end, especially when travel costs and rent swallow wages and returning home becomes impossible. You ask whether this exploitation sits baked into the system, and I answer that law and corporate norms can restrain it, raising safety, hours, and pay when conscience and enforcement walk the floor together. One clear example came when major buyers agreed not to purchase from growers, mistreating tomato pickers, proving that supply chains can pressure bad actors when purchasers treat dignity as a non-negotiable condition of doing business. In most markets, wages follow the simple math of scarcity and abundance, drifting lower when applicants abound and inching higher when skills run short. Yet even then pay often falls short of what households require to live decently. That is why workers assemble unions, seeking collective bargaining after employers argue quitting was always an option, while unions press for mandatory membership to prevent free riding and to build the strength necessary to negotiate. When talks collapsed, strikes followed, sometimes crushed by hired enforcers, and one notorious railcar dispute spread across states after wage cuts without rent relief, leaving deaths, damages, and a nation confronted by anger it could no longer ignore. Legal protections expanded the right to strike and set a baseline wage, yet the federal floor remains $7.25, unchanged since 2009 and far below what most families consider a genuine living wage. Some propose alternatives or complements, from refundable credits and guaranteed income to sharing decisions between management and labor, aligning representation with responsibility so companies hear voices from the shop floor before choices harden into doctrine. Another path gives workers ownership and a say through enterprises where employees hold shares and help decide what to make, how to make it, where to make it, and how to divide the profits that follow. Stock ownership by ordinary workers sounds elegant, yet a sliver of investors controls most shares, and many households have little spare cash, choosing home equity over financial assets when savings finally accumulate. A universal savings plan could help, with employers contributing 50 cents per hour into portable accounts invested prudently, raising typical retirement balances well beyond current medians and giving future retirees sturdier cushions atop Social Security. Even decent pay cannot fix every workplace frustration, because some jobs are physically demanding, some are risky, and some are mind-numbingly repetitive, leaving people hungry for meaning alongside income when they clock in each day. Too many big box aisles and quick-serve counters feel understaffed and underspirited, as scheduling software maximizes efficiency while customers navigate fewer helpers, reminding us that treating labor only as cost invites service that feels transactional rather than human. Wellness programs attempt to improve lives and save money, coaching healthier habits, and supporting people managing chronic conditions, with many firms recouping investments through better productivity and fewer expensive emergencies when prevention becomes routine rather than occasional. Time away matters too. Yet one rich economy guarantees no paid leave while neighbors across the ocean mandate several weeks plus holidays, and the absence lands hardest on low-wage, part-time, and small business employees already stretched thin. Despite progress, union strength has weakened in places, and a high-profile vote at a southern auto plant rejected organizing by a narrow margin, reflecting hesitation even as history shows collective action has raised wages and improved conditions. Hold that image as we step into the next room, where machines and software gather like storm clouds, and the riddle shifts from fairness on today's shift to whether tomorrow's shift exists for everyone at all. I open the next file and ask whether the future has enough chairs for everyone, because we can already hear machines sliding into seats that once belonged to people with lunch pails. This is a case about job creation when automation grows steadily, about whether capitalism can keep inventing worthwhile work faster than software, robots, and algorithms quietly vacuum tasks from shop floors and front desks. Right now, one labor agency counts global unemployment above 200 million, and warns it could worsen, which is like smelling smoke in a crowded theater before anyone notices the first restless flickers. In the 1870s, roughly 70 to 80% of Americans worked in agriculture, while today less than 2% do, and manufacturing once backfilled the gap before shrinking in its share of national output. The open question is whether the service economy can absorb the shortfall and pay decently, or whether we will drift into a landscape of scattered gigs stitched together like temporary patches on worn jackets. We have seen this fear before, when British textile workers smashed frames and burned mills as new machines threatened livelihoods, and authorities eventually suppressed the revolt while the factory age kept tightening its grip. Today the disruption feels broader, with publishing, music, retail, and manufacturing all transformed, and many of us wondering whether human workers are losing a race where the competitor improves daily without asking for weekends. Look at shopping, where digital storefronts undercut prices, close familiar shops, deploy robots inside warehouses, and even experiment with aerial deliveries, leaving fewer in-store rows in many communities asking where the next paycheck might come from. The supply of job seekers keeps growing, with laid-off workers still searching, graduates hunting for meaningful starts, and potential cuts in defense procurement threatening additional positions in towns that rely on bases, contractors, and complex supply chains. Another wave may arrive as shorter sentences release nonviolent offenders into tight markets, where background checks block interviews, and the line between rehabilitation and repeated exclusion looks like a turnstile spinning without an open gate. When recessions hit hard, governments have created work through spending, as happened during the Great Depression, and while recoveries eventually returned, the present question is whether faster automation gives this old playbook diminishing power. One observer argued that rising automation might eliminate millions of roles across sectors, boost incomes for designers and coders, but still leave many displaced, requiring broader safety nets and a stronger nonprofit sector to handle unmet needs. People debate who faces the greatest risk, because low-wage jobs can be cheaply done by humans, while many white-collar tasks like bookkeeping, document preparation, and even some teaching and rehabilitation increasingly move to screens and software. Studies warn that nearly half of current jobs could be automated within 2 decades, especially as so-called cognitive systems learn to parse language, answer questions, and recommend treatments faster than busy humans juggling multiple responsibilities. The nagging riddle is whether enough new, complex work will appear to replace what disappears, especially when young firms scale globally with tiny headcounts, while older giants once employed vast communities around production and distribution. If the share going to wages continues to shrink while the top slice rises, overall demand weakens, fewer households purchase durable goods, and even healthy sales sometimes generate jobs abroad rather than at home. Some analysts expect slower growth ahead, implying fewer new positions per year, and suggest the rapid progress of the past 2 centuries may be an exception rather than a pattern we can count on indefinitely. Yet there are millions of openings that go unfilled, particularly in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, because workers lack the training employers require, which turns the job market into a hallway of locked doors without matching keys. The response includes targeted retraining, stronger math and science in earlier grades, elevating teaching into a respected, better-paid profession, guiding teenagers toward realistic paths, local partnerships across sectors, employer investment in skills, and easier entry for needed global talent. Another avenue is entrepreneurship, where ideas become firms with help from mentors, investors, and patient capital, yet would-be founders still face obstacles, and some countries make starting a business far easier and faster than others. Emerging technologies like mobile internet, automation of knowledge work, networked sensors, cloud services, advanced robotics, autonomous vehicles, genomics, energy storage, 3-dimensional printing, new materials, resource extraction methods, and renewables could cumulatively reshape industries and generate opportunities scattered across many niches. As costs rise overseas and speed matters more, some manufacturing may drift back, while designers, Engineers and logistics specialists in rich markets already drive production done elsewhere, blurring categories that once separated factories from the brains directing them. Significant sums sit parked overseas because of tax differentials, and lowering the domestic rate could attract funds home for factories and infrastructure, potentially boosting employment and output enough to offset revenue loss at the point of entry. In the meantime, when the private sector falls short, the public sector can hire people to build schools, maintain clinics, and repair roads, because supporting prolonged unemployment actually costs more than paying for useful, visible work. As we close this folder, the mystery bends toward a new corridor, asking whether companies properly account for the costs they leave outside their ledgers, because hidden bills have a way of arriving late with interest. I pull a fresh file from the stack and ask you to follow the smudge fingerprints, because this case is about costs companies create yet never pay, the kind that quietly land on everyone else. If markets were perfect detectives, everyone would know every price, every risk, every alternative, and be free to move instantly. Yet in the real world, information and mobility cost time, money, nerves, and hope. That is why governments collect and publish data, offering maps for producers, middlemen, and consumers, because better knowledge reduces wasteful detours and helps decisions resemble navigation instead of guesswork through fog. Economists describe a sweet spot called a Pareto optimum, where no voluntary trade can improve one person's lot without making another worse, and deviations from that ideal signal what they call market failure. 3 culprits stalk this alleyway again and again, namely hidden spillovers from production or consumption, the overuse of shared resources, and the power of dominant firms to block rivals before shoppers ever choose. Take the plant that makes steel, which rightly pays for ore, electricity, machines, and labor, yet conveniently leaves smoke in the air and waste in the river, handing neighbors the bill without asking. Total cost includes private costs and social costs, but only the first appears on company ledgers, letting prices fall below true costs and output rise above responsible levels, while someone else breathes, drinks, and pays. With public budgets already stretched, it makes sense to charge polluters directly, not as punishment, but as motivation. Because bills concentrate minds and cleaner processes suddenly look smarter when doing nothing gets expensive. One approach is a tax on carbon, raising costs with emissions, so firms redesign and conserve, while another approach caps total pollution, issues tradable credits, and ratchets the limit downward as technology improves. Cap and trade introduces a marketplace for cleaner air, where innovators who cut faster can sell surplus permits, though everyone argues over how quickly the ceiling should fall and who must participate. Some propose tariffs on imports from places ignoring the rules, which collides with guardians of free trade, forcing an uncomfortable question about whether planetary safety outranks the convenience of unconditioned commerce. Water suffers too, so penalties for dumping or strict discharge limits push companies towards safer methods, reminding executives that pipes are not magic tunnels to nowhere, but expensive liabilities when regulators finally notice. Spillovers happen on the household side as well. When cigarettes poison nearby lungs, litter turns parks into unpaid jobs for city crews, and long commutes or heavy vehicles spread exhaust like an invisible tax. Governments can respond with higher fees on dirtier cars, steep taxes on tobacco, and clear rules about shared spaces, which nudge behavior while honoring choice, like speed limits that protect, not imprison. There are positive ripples too, like employers who train, benefiting society beyond any single payroll. Yet some firms argue these gifts balance harmful practices, a claim that sounds tidy but rarely convinces communities breathe in fumes. Now look at common spaces, the meadows, forests, and waters we all treasure, where unregulated access invites overuse, because each individual gains by taking more while everyone loses when the resource collapses. Picture 2 neighbors grazing sheep, each preferring free public grass to nurturing private pasture, until the shared field browns in the dust, proving how rational choices can conspire to ruin the commons. We can protect such places by writing straightforward rules about hours, numbers, fires, pets, and cleanliness, or by rationing access through permits, which respects the resource's limits the way speed restricts dangerous curves. Where water is scarce, governments can raise prices, cap industrial withdrawals, discourage wasteful habits, and sometimes block methods that consume excessive volumes. Because scarcity turns luxury into lifeline and demands seriousness instead of slogans. Turn to market power, where healthy competition should keep prices honest and quality rising. Yet barriers to entry let incumbents fortify the castle while newcomers count the cost and retreat before battle. Licenses, patents, scale advantages, distribution deals, and plain old brand loyalty can deter challengers, leaving consumers with fewer choices and innovation strangled in the crib, unless some outside force breaks the stalemate. Sometimes the rescuer is technology, like a newcomer using digital tools to outmaneuver a legacy giant stuck in yesterday's equipment, or an advertiser who persuades the public that better design deserves a chance. Public agencies intervene too, chasing monopolies, policing collusion, or unbundling access, though every intervention carries risk that the cure proves costlier than the disease when programs become clumsy, captured, or unexpectedly distort behavior. Some scholars warn frequently about government failure, saying mistakes, subsidies, bailouts, and controls may misallocate more than markets, while others insist the state must still correct unfairness and inefficiency, using rules that respect incentives. The detective in me says this is not theology but triage, because sometimes markets self-correct through entry or invention, and sometimes they do not, which is when carefully crafted policy earns its badge. Our trail now bends toward a bigger canvas where nature itself takes the witness stand, and we must ask whether the very environment can remain healthy when profit ignores the bills it passes along. I set the next case file on the table and ask whether the planet can keep breathing easily while our economy keeps sprinting, because this investigation is about nature paying bills that business often leaves unpaid. Just before one important autumn, scientists and experts issued a stark warning that unchecked emissions could trigger food shortages. Rising seas, drowned cities, mass species losses, and heat so fierce outdoor life becomes dangerous. I turn to you and ask whether our economic system naturally shields the environment, or whether it tends to scar it, and if so, how we might persuade companies to pursue sustainability without losing momentum. Some voices insist commerce can embrace ecological thinking and even improve profits by eliminating waste, shifting toward renewable power, and building feedback that keeps environmental performance visible and accountable throughout operations. Others argued the system's deeper logic pushes in the opposite direction, claiming real protection would require different foundations entirely, because profit motives alone rarely prioritize planetary limits over short-term gains and political influence. Historically, plenty of businesses treated nature as a warehouse with no checkout desk, clearing forests, draining wetlands, spraying pesticides, and mining resources as if supplies were infinite and consequences distant. The land itself rebelled when overflowing stripped topsoil and drought delivered dust storms. While growing cities filled air and rivers with pollution, fish died in a Great Lake, and smog rolled like a daily curtain across a sprawling basin. Even icons of the wild struggle on thinning ice while new rigs press forward at sea, reminding us that extraction often accelerates precisely when warnings multiply across headlines and scientific reports. Climate and energy collide in policy rooms because cheap coal can generate electricity, yet burning it traps heat, raises seas, stirs stronger storms, acidifies oceans, and brings trouble when temperatures move beyond a narrow comfort band. Extra warmth pulls moisture from soils, deepens droughts, fans bigger fires, stresses staple crops, and shifts insects and diseases into new regions, while species losses climb toward horrifying fractions of all life we know. The practical answer points toward renewables, which means higher short-term costs for households, court battles from incumbent industries, and long debates over timelines, yet cleaner power remains the clearest route when we tally full consequences honestly. We did not arrive at awareness by accident, because poets, naturalists, and organizers taught generations to see connections in nature, and reforms followed that created parks, watchdog groups, and a federal agency dedicated to environmental protection. Public behavior changed as labels highlighted energy use, households sorted waste, factories installed cleaner equipment, and a controversial extraction technique expanded gas supplies while coal plants closed and nuclear projects reemerged alongside new investments abroad. These energy shifts carry their own risks, since nuclear reduces emissions yet raises safety and waste questions, even as many countries see it as a preferred option to meet growing demand without further damaging climate stability. Finance has noticed, with global lenders and insurers demanding ecological due diligence, and some brands embedding sustainability into procurement so that suppliers meet stringent standards before a single order gets approved. Even with progress, critics contend the hidden environmental ledger still grows faster than our production benefits, suggesting our headline output overstates prosperity by ignoring the damage that never appears on monthly reports. Another perspective notes we emit less per unit of production than decades ago, yet total emissions keep climbing, material demand strains supplies, and consumer culture encourages constant upgrades that amplify waste and resource pressure. The anxiety behind these patterns shows up in status competitions and purchasing habits, as people chase acceptance through ownership while corporations chase volume growth through continual replacement, locking both sides into a treadmill. Critics of denial argue that markets handle private goods well, but struggle to protect shared assets, pointing to lobbying by fossil fuel interests and urging locally rooted production to reduce transport pollution and reclaim community control. Meanwhile, sobering updates remind us that seas are rising, glaciers retreating, and summer ice shrinking in the north, a list that reads like a slow courtroom record of changes accumulating beyond comfortable doubt. So where does responsibility land, and how do we keep prosperity without a planetary hangover? Because this investigation searches for the point where enterprise and ecology stop arguing and begin collaborating. Part of the answer is substituting cleaner fuels, tightening standards, and pricing damage transparently, yet part is cultural, building pride around stewardship, not accumulation, and defining success as value delivered within nature's budget. You and I can feel how this changes daily life, from sorting recyclables to choosing efficient appliances. Yet these gestures matter most when supply chains, financing, and regulations pull in the same direction at scale. When I stand back, I see a story improving unevenly, with genuine strides in awareness and technology, and persistent habits that keep pushing boundaries, which is exactly why momentum must become policy rather than personal virtue. The next photo on our desk examines what happens when the wider economy stumbles. Because growth rarely moves in a straight line, and instability can magnify every environmental and social vulnerability we have been tracing. I slide another folder toward you and ask why otherwise rational markets swing from confidence to panic. Because our next mystery is about the rhythms of expansion and contraction that keep unsettling households and boardrooms. These waves do not feel like abstract charts. They feel like job offers evaporating, shops closing early, mortgage applications denied, and then a sudden burst of optimism as hiring returns and budgets loosen just enough to exhale. Two forces inject uncertainty into decisions even before managers pick a strategy, namely the persistence of business cycles in capitalist economies and the heightened turbulence born of globalization and rapid technological change. Cycles appear baked in the market economies, with the United States experiencing dozens since the 19th century, and in recent decades seeing short downturns followed by longer climbs back to previous peaks, a rhythm that complicates planning everywhere. The policy aim sounds straightforward in theory: to sustain healthy growth that provides jobs for everyone willing to work while keeping prices stable enough that paychecks hold their meaning rather than melting away through rising costs. A typical cycle passes through contraction, trough, expansion, and peak, each stage leaving its fingerprints on spending, hiring, markets, and moods, while offering different clues to leaders hoping to navigate rather than simply endure the next turn. Contraction arrives as growth slows toward low single digits, markets turn bearish, and caution spreads, signaling that momentum has faded and decision-makers should protect cash, reassess pipelines, and prepare for further weakening before conditions finally stabilize. The trough follows when declines continue but shrink each period, like a fever breaking slowly, giving forecasters their first evidence that the worst has passed and the ground might be firm enough to support a tentative turnaround. Expansion feels different immediately, with jobs returning, demand strengthening, and markets rallying as growth moves back into healthier ranges that can persist for years if policy and management restrain. Excess and resist shortcuts masquerading as strategy. Peaks emerge when exuberance outruns reality, expectations inflate, and price pressures build, often after several quarters of very fast growth, leaving the economy perched on a ledge where a slip becomes the opening scene of the next downturn. Confidence threads through each stage, because when incomes feel secure and assets seem solid, consumers buy sooner, businesses hire and invest. Investors accept more risk, and the good times paradoxically plant seeds for the peak and eventual reversal. Analysts watch a dashboard of indicators moving roughly together, including earnings, unemployment and quits, new housing, prices, manufacturing output, bankruptcies, retail sales, market valuations, and the money supply, looking for the combination that signals turning points convincingly. When recessions bite, central banks push rates down and buy assets to flood credit channels. Yet sometimes even near zero borrowing costs cannot restart spending quickly, shifting debate toward taxes, incentives, and direct government purchases to accelerate recovery. One camp advises austerity through wage restraint, cost cuts, and delayed investment until confidence returns on its own, while another favors stimulus spending on infrastructure and social needs, noting that imposed austerity worsened the stress in several European economies. Evidence from one large program suggested that broad spending helped lower unemployment several points within 3 years by channeling money to projects and households, thereby supporting demand that created more paychecks and steadier momentum for the private sector. Housing finance reforms could cushion contractions by linking payments to neighborhood prices, reducing monthly obligations when values fall, and sharing gains modestly when they recover, spreading risk across lenders and borrowers rather than concentrating it on families facing collapse. Beyond cyclical swings, leaders confront turbulence, a faster, less predictable environment shaped by technology, globalization, and empowered customers, demanding new disciplines to read signals early, test responses quickly, and avoid complacency when conditions look deceptively calm. Information power is tilted toward customers, who now consult networks, ratings, and regional platforms before buying, and who broadcast experiences afterward, forcing companies to treat transparency as a default and responsiveness as non-negotiable for survival. One angry traveler can rally thousands with a single site or post, turning word of mouth into a hurricane that strips market share quickly, which means vigilance and genuine service become everyday shields against sudden reputational shocks. Since elimination is impossible, the practical goal is moderation, recognizing bubbles earlier and cooling speculation before damage spreads, then moving decisively during downturns to restore credit and spending so companies and households regain their footing. Companies can also temper turbulence by tracking changing needs, measuring perceived value, watching rivals closely, and building faster responses, which will not erase uncertainty, but can reduce true surprises and strengthen resilience when shocks inevitably arrive. The memory of the financial crisis still shapes behavior, encouraging caution, tighter standards, efforts to prevent another housing and mortgage bubble, and less appetite for risky credit practices that once built a precarious tower of cards. These dynamics appear in every economic system, though free markets feel them acutely, and history shows that centralized regimes did not eliminate cycles. They simply concealed them, leaving citizens poorly informed about the true health of distant regions. As we close this file, the trail points toward motives that magnify instability, because narrow self-interest can push decisions that look brilliant today, yet weaken the system tomorrow, a door we will push open carefully next. I lean closer and slide a crisp folder across the table, saying this case asks whether narrow self-interest, celebrated like a virtue at parades, quietly saws through the floorboards of the very house we all share. You and I grew up hearing that freedom means chasing personal goals with grit and hustle. Yet we also rely on schools, hospitals, and safety nets that do not spring from private ambition alone. Capitalism leans toward individual rewards and initiative, framed by a famous question about choosing self-reliance over government help, which I answer by insisting on both personal responsibility and community care in a balanced, mutually respectful arrangement. Extreme champions of autonomy would cheer novels where defiant creators refuse compromise, where industrial leaders walk away rather than accept regulation, and where dependence is scorned as parasitic, painting altruism as manipulation and elevating solitary genius into a civic religion. The culture absorbed that message through fiction and film, where a glossy speech praises greed as clarifying and unstoppable, though many critics warn that this storyline glamorizes domination and forgets the ordinary people who carry the load every weekday. Before we chase villains down alleys, I rewind to the Enlightenment, where thinkers challenged hereditary power, sketched natural rights, and inspired a declaration that governments derive legitimacy from consent, placing personal liberty at the center of civic architecture. Another voice argued that self-interest can power prosperity when tempered by conscience, because markets require decency, empathy, and moral sentiments if private striving is to lift communities rather than trample them under animal energies alone. 20th century economists refined the case for limited government and personal freedom, warning that planned systems suffocate creativity and drift toward authoritarianism, while free markets reward talent and discipline, provided institutions preserve open competition and voluntary exchange. Yet the pendulum can swing too far when hyper-individualism becomes a creed, triggering a countercurrent that emphasizes relationships, mutual obligations, and the idea that humans flourish inside supportive communities, not only as isolated economic actors. Cultural scholars observe differences between individualist and collectivist societies, noting that some cultures prize social harmony and reputation above assertive self-display, using shame more than guilt to regulate behavior and keep people aligned with shared expectations. Collectivism taken to extremes becomes state control as regimes elevate the masses over personal freedom and seize productive assets, whereas milder versions accept private property while tasking government with securing the common good more actively. A modern communitarian view rejects both authoritarianism and atomized liberty, arguing for a balance that preserves a moral voice, promotes open participation, and encourages responsibility without crushing individuality beneath conformity or hierarchy. In this debate, advocates propose universal rights like healthcare, education, and environmental safety, while skeptics argue property should not be taxed for shared causes, revealing a recurring tension between negative rights and positive guarantees. The wise answer is equilibrium, a society where liberty and social order reinforce each other, and where neither the individual nor the collective claims permanent priority over the other's legitimate needs and contributions. Now shift the camera to corporate life, where many firms embrace corporate social responsibility, justifying it as reciprocity for public infrastructure, as reputation building that deepens loyalty, and as a visible rebuttal to the suspicion that profits always eclipse principles. Donations scatter easily across many requests, yet a focused commitment to one significant cause can resonate with customers and employees, as when a company serving women invested heavily in research and treatment for a disease that disproportionately affects them. To understand practice, we interviewed leaders from dozens of global companies, asking how they chose causes, measured social impact, and evaluated business benefits, and then reported patterns that help organizations link generosity with thoughtful metrics and clearer strategies. Our later work cataloged 6 ways to express responsibility, including promotions, partnerships, marketing, philanthropy, volunteering, and responsible operations, with standout practitioners demonstrating that purpose and profit can reinforce each other rather than compete destructively. Even then, counting reputational returns remains tricky because many variables move simultaneously. So moral obligation stays central, captured by the question of how to make a firm serve society while still honoring commitments to owners. Remember also that capitalist models differ by region, with one tradition leaning harder toward market autonomy and another more toward communal protections, showing that freedom's architecture comes in several blueprints rather than a single universal design. Beyond firms and nations, an intriguing index ranks countries by their contributions to global well-being across science, security, order, environment, and health, suggesting that doing good for the world can attract investment, cooperation, and competitive advantage. When I stitch these clues together, the pattern shows that narrow self-interest frays trust, invites backlash, and weakens resilience, whereas enlightened self-interest, anchored in ethics and community, turns competition into a game more people can afford to play. The path forward asks leaders to design incentives that reward service alongside profit, teach citizens the skills of stewardship, and build institutions that nudge ambition toward outcomes neighbors can applaud without feeling like props in someone else's triumph. Hold that thought as we open the next folder marked Debt and Finance, because incentives become sharpest when money is borrowed, rules are loosened, and risk migrates silently through the system until a sudden tremor exposes hidden cracks. I flip open a thick folder and ask why debt keeps slipping under doors like smoke. Because the mystery today is how borrowing and finance can both fuel prosperity and threaten to suffocate the very rooms they warm. Back in 2007, the mood was triumphant, with stocks humming, houses selling fast, and expensive cars everywhere. Yet underneath sat excess borrowing, risky mortgage, eager lenders, inflated ratings, and hesitant regulators watching a slow fuse burn. When Lehman failed, credit lines snapped, banks mistrusted each other, risks hid inside derivatives, and the machinery stalled as nobody could gauge exposures clearly, vaporizing trillions and turning a seemingly perfect engine into a frightening rattle overnight. To understand the buildup, I rewind to the long glow from 1945 to 1970. When the United States thrived as an undamaged supplier to rebuilding nations, unions shaped wages, and families grew accustomed to steadily expanding paychecks and consumption. During the 70s, competitors returned stronger, with German manufacturers earning premiums for quality and Japanese firms winning share across autos, electronics, and more, challenging American producers and cracking the expectation that leadership would last untroubled forever. The crash left scars that statistics sometimes hide, because many Americans stopped looking for work or accepted part-time roles, yielding underemployment around 17%, while the official rate hovered near 7% during one sobering autumn of counting. Meanwhile, taxpayers shouldered staggering interest on federal obligations, paying hundreds of billions annually and facing projections of several trillion more over a decade, meaning a growing share of revenue would vanish before schools, clinics, or infrastructure received their due. Most of the debt sat in domestic hands, yet that comfort came with a cost, since more payments to financial institutions meant fewer dollars for basic programs, a reality that fueled rancorous debates, commissions, and temporary sequestration without durable resolution. Even with core measures steady, families felt inflation differently because essentials like food, energy, healthcare, and education are outside the official core index, stirring worries that repaying mountains of obligations would become harder as costs kept climbing. At the same time, incomes at the top rebounded briskly while typical households lagged, leaving the middle squeezed by tuition and medical bills, less willing to spend and more anxious about slipping a rung on the ladder they once trusted. Spending still powered most economic activity, yet forecasts remained modest despite massive monetary support, reflecting a deeper shift from a manufacturing base to a financial order, where Wall Street's weight grew even as factory jobs and related roles thinned sharply. Household borrowing soared over decades, piling mortgage, credit cards, and student loans into totals that grew faster than incomes, with debt ratios peaking before the crash, easing afterward, leaving borrowers carrying balances that reshaped choices about cars, homes, and families. Student debt climbed toward over $1 trillion and spread across tens of millions, delaying purchases and even marriages, prompting proposals to forgive balances, cap rates under 4%, or limit payments to a slice of income to soften the drag. Even beyond tuition, Many households live paycheck to paycheck with limited savings, substantial balances in collection, and heavy reliance on nutrition assistance, signaling that additional borrowing capacity was thin and that consumer demand might falter without healthier underlying finances. The culture of borrowing became central to growth itself, encouraging purchases today against tomorrow's earnings, with high credit card interest feeding financial firms rather than producers, and with household debt arguably tracking activity better than employment during uneven recoveries. New pushes appeared again, from zero-down auto offers to subprime car loans and payday storefronts urging rollovers, prompting a new federal watchdog to craft rules aimed at curbing predatory practices before another bubble crept from driveway to balance sheet. Finance itself swelled relative to the broader economy, with a few giant banks holding a much larger share of assets, the sector's profits dominating the corporate total, and research warning that oversized finance can depress growth instead of nourishing it. Some observers described the slide from market-friendly competition toward business-friendly cronyism, with armies of lobbyists reshaping rules, while protest movements from different directions seem to target the same tangled alliance of concentrated economic and political power. Innovations multiplied as engineers bundled payments into securities sliced by risk, added opaque derivatives, and let hedge funds roam. Yet not every invention was harmful, since some missing markets deserve coverage for livelihoods, home equity, or income-linked borrowing. If size cannot be tamed through restructuring, regulation must counter leverage and reach, breaking institutions along functional lines, reviving separations between commercial and investment activities, and preventing conglomerates from using insured deposits to bankroll ventures better left to risk capital. Raising capital cushions would slow growth a shade, but make failure less contagious, while a rule barring proprietary trading by insured banks push speculation back toward markets and affirm that deposit insurance should protect savings rather than subsidize wagers. Even so, lobbying weakened many safeguards and partially reversed others, leaving a long list of complex instruments still demanding transparency, tougher oversight, consistent ratings, better paid regulators, and a banking culture inclined to finance productive enterprise rather than easy balance sheet maneuvers. That is why I keep returning to the scene of the crime with last question, because the suspects who blocked reforms do not vanish. They simply change offices, which leads us straight into the smoke-filled chamber where politics rearranges economics. I open this next case and ask whether democracy steers capitalism or whether capitalism quietly grabs the wheel, because the answer determines whose voice shapes the rules that touch every paycheck, ballot, and boardroom. If ownership is widespread, citizens understand their stakes and vote accordingly. Yet when a small fraction holds a towering share, political equality starts to feel ceremonial rather than real in the everyday grind. Modern corporate capitalism lets capital move wherever returns look brightest, loosening ties to towns or nations and widening the distance between shareholder interests and community needs, which tilts conversations long before any vote is cast. That tilt deepens when professional persuaders work the corridors of power, because I tell you lobbying exists to influence legislators, regulators, and judges, and the industry has multiplied in size and spending across recent decades. I remember one political thinker labeling the structure a near paralysis of competing interest groups, a kind of government by veto constraining executives and forcing hard questions to languish while the future speeds ahead. We are right to worry when influence steers votes away from constituents and toward clients, though sometimes advocacy corrects misinformation and advances public health, education, or environmental protections ordinary families will welcome. Yet powerful industries often press for subsidies, barriers, or privileges that burden everyone else, with energy, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and defense offering familiar examples of lobbying that distorts prices, access, and public budgets. The plot thickens with campaign finance, because elections are expensive and parties cannot cover everything. So lawmakers depend on donors whose generosity may not set votes directly, but still shapes gratitude and future ambitions. After office, the revolving door beckons with salaries far beyond public pay, which adds another incentive to please those who might later hire, bending priorities subtly, even when laws forbid explicit exchanges. One economist described a cycle where tax cuts increase resources for political influence, which then secures further cuts, starves budgets, and drives pressure to shrink services rather than revisit earlier generosity toward the wealthiest households. Lobbying itself looks like marketing with clients, targeting, messaging, and relationship management, and while data provided may be accurate, the framing often tilts decisions toward outcomes that suit the sponsor's interests. Insiders even admit that many requests for contributions originate from elected officials themselves, turning solicitation into a ritual that feels like legal extortion and consumes countless hours better spent governing. A prominent scholar argued that court decisions expanded corporate speech, enabling large sums to shape legislative agendas, not always through obvious bribes, but through earlier adjustments that sidestep straightforward proof of influence. Studies have found links between political activity and corporate performance, including reports of returns on lobbying investment that would dazzle any manager, which explains why the practice persists despite periodic scandals. Corruption complicates markets further in poorer countries, where bribes to officials, military officers, and ministers sell national resources while citizens see little benefit, leaving honest bidders grappling with whether to match illicit offers or withdraw. Several steps can reduce such rot, including outlawing bribery decisively, empowering specialized agencies, rewarding whistleblowers, and following the money into secrecy havens so that stolen wealth cannot hide behind numbered doors. One nation even restricts its firms abroad through a law penalizing foreign corrupt practices, which raised standards for many companies and signaled that winning contracts should not require envelopes passed under tables. Government itself sits at the center of this drama because regulation can prevent harm and balance power, yet excessive or clumsy rules may cost more than they deliver, sparking familiar ideological arguments that never quite end. An influential economist once argued that public agencies and unions can counterbalance concentrated corporate power, creating fairness and safety when markets alone would otherwise tilt toward domination by the largest players. Tax policy tells another story about values, allocating burdens between sales levies and income rates, deciding how steeply to tax the highest earners, and determining what corporations should contribute to shared infrastructures they rely upon daily. Trade choices then shift gains and losses across classes, because low tariffs can lower prices for the poor while displacing domestic work, and the real question becomes how to weigh outcomes over time rather than react to headlines. Periodic reviews of regulations and taxes can prune deadwood and refine designs, ensuring good intentions remain effective rather than rigid, and giving citizens confidence that rules evolve with evidence rather than with slogans. We should also face how a tiny group of extraordinarily wealthy individuals steers elections and policies through donations and advocacy, with well-known financiers illustrating how concentrated fortunes purchase disproportionate attention from leaders. Some propose counterweights that include steeper progressivity, limits on transfers, and higher levies on luxury purchases and estates, aiming to tame outsized influence while leaving room for enterprise and generosity that genuinely benefits the public. The cliffhanger here is simple and unsettling, because unless democratic rules reclaim independence from money's gravity, economic policy will keep reflecting donors first and citizens second, which leads inevitably to short-term thinking that starves tomorrow. I slide a thin folder toward you and whisper that our next mystery is time itself. Because capitalism loves quick wins while the future waits patiently, tapping its foot and wondering why long-term investment keeps getting postponed. The smart way to run any enterprise is to plan for now and later at once, keeping today's revenue targets in sight while building tomorrow's engines. A juggling act that looks elegant only when performed with discipline. Family firms often handle this balance better because they do not report to the stock market every quarter, which lets them plow money into projects that pay off slowly and even tolerate temporary losses when necessary. Public utilities also keep one eye on the horizon, because regulators expect them to maintain profitability while expanding capacity for future demand. Creating a structure where long-term investment is not optional, it is part of the job. Publicly traded companies face a harsher clock, since missing earnings expectations invites downgrades, rising borrowing costs, and impatient investors, which tempts managers to smooth results, shift sales between quarters, and prioritize appearances over the messy reality of experimentation. Fast-moving traders compound the pressure by jumping in and out of positions, turning capital into a restless tourist rather than an impatient resident, and leaving fewer funds aligned with the slow work of building capabilities that endure. Even when leaders want to invest, the long-term budget depends on short-term performance, because firms first chase quarterly goals, then fund research, development, and infrastructure with whatever surplus remains, or by raising money through additional shares and bonds. You can see the consequences beneath our feet, where roads, bridges, grids, and water systems graded poorly by engineers signal years of underinvestment, with estimates calling for vast sums just to avoid falling further behind as repairs grow costlier. Other countries seem to build faster and better, according to one global survey, which is why infrastructure headlines sparkle abroad while at home the most reliable investment appears to be digital networks that conveniently charge monthly subscriber fees. A striking example sits in an Asian industrial city that scaled rapidly by pairing infrastructure with education, drawing thousands of firms and dozens of universities, and showing how decisive planning can transform a region's economic prospects within a generation. The uncomfortable question is whether an economy focused on quarterly profits and smaller public budgets can still mobilize enough capital to rebuild what everyone uses daily. Because the benefits of world-class infrastructure compound across households and businesses. One economist warned that an obsession with near-term profits increases financial fragility, as speculative money enters long projects, then exits at the first sign of delay, turning investment cycles into panics while companies scramble to protect short-term numbers. The costs of hesitation are not abstract, since better infrastructure lowers logistics bills, creates jobs, connects regions, and boosts urban productivity and livability, benefits that rarely show up neatly on a quarterly scorecard but reshape competitiveness over decades. Behind the scenes, compensation design tightens the knot, because executives rewarded heavily with stock options naturally focus on share prices, sometimes enjoying gains driven by market tides, while capital projects quietly fail to earn their true cost. Boards need measures that isolate real value created from noise. Otherwise, leaders chase optics rather than outcomes, and the day arrives when dividends wobble, valuations slide, and everyone asks why yesterday's soaring price never translated into durable capacity. Thankfully, there are counter-examples where leaders defended long-term priorities against pressure, choosing customer value, fair pricing, and meaningful experience over quick margin boosts, proving that patient strategy can coexist with growth when vision holds steady under criticism. Still, hope does not replace structure, so we return to the blueprint and consider how to channel more resources into multi-year projects without pretending quarterly accountability must disappear or that investors will suddenly love uncertainty. Part of the answer is candid communication about the pipeline, pairing realistic short-term targets with transparent milestones for long-run initiatives so that missed goals reflect honest learning rather than creative accounting or frantic end-of-quarter theatrics. Another part is financial architecture that rewards staying power, encouraging capital to accompany projects through their awkward adolescence, instead of rewarding exits that leave half-built systems stranded and managers defensive about the next reporting window. Public policy can help by prioritizing essential infrastructure with consistent funding, because bridges, grids, and water systems cannot be rebuilt with leftover budget scraps, and predictable investment multiplies private activity the way good soil encourages new roots. We also need to separate luck from leadership when evaluating executives, distinguishing market-wide lifts from choices that genuinely improve products, processes, and capabilities. So rewards do not encourage superficial maneuvers that flatter charts while starving the workshop. Spending still powered most economic activity, Yet forecasts remain modest despite massive monetary support, reflecting a deeper shift from a manufacturing base to a financial order, where Wall Street's weight grew even as factory jobs and related roles thinned sharply. Household borrowing soared over decades, piling mortgage, credit cards, and student loans into totals that grew faster than incomes, with debt ratios peaking before the crash, easing afterward, leaving borrowers carrying balances that reshaped choices about cars, homes, and families. Student debt climbed toward over $1 trillion and spread across tens of millions, delaying purchases and even marriages, prompting proposals to forgive balances, cap rates under 4%, or limit payments to a slice of income to soften the drag. Even beyond tuition, many households live paycheck to paycheck with limited savings, substantial balances in collection, and heavy reliance on nutrition assistance, signaling that additional borrowing capacity was thin and that consumer demand might falter without healthier underlying finances. The culture of borrowing became central to growth itself, encouraging purchases today against tomorrow's earnings, with high credit card interest feeding financial firms rather than producers, and with household debt arguably tracking activity better than employment during uneven recoveries. New pushes appeared again, from zero-down auto offers to subprime car loans and payday storefronts urging rollovers, prompting a new federal watchdog to craft rules aimed at curbing predatory practices before another bubble crept from driveway to balance sheet. Finance itself swelled relative to the broader economy, with a few giant banks holding a much larger share of assets, the sector's profits dominating the corporate total, and research warning that oversized finance can depress growth instead of nourishing it. Some observers described the slide from market-friendly competition toward business-friendly cronyism, with armies of lobbyists reshaping rules, while protest movements from different directions seem to target the same tangled alliance of concentrated economic and political power. Innovations multiplied as engineers bundled payments into securities sliced by risk, added opaque derivatives, and let hedge funds roam. Yet not every invention was harmful, since some missing markets deserve coverage for livelihoods, home equity, or income-linked borrowing. If size cannot be tamed through restructuring, regulation must counter leverage and reach, breaking institutions along functional lines, reviving separations between commercial and investment activities, and preventing conglomerates from using insured deposits to bankroll ventures better left to risk capital. Raising capital cushions would slow growth a shade, but make failure less contagious, while a rule barring proprietary trading by insured banks push speculation back toward markets and affirm that deposit insurance should protect savings rather than subsidize wagers. Even so, lobbying weakened many safeguards and partially reversed others, leaving a long list of complex instruments still demanding transparency, tougher oversight, consistent ratings, better paid regulators, and a banking culture inclined to finance productive enterprise rather than easy balance sheet maneuvers. That is why I keep returning to the scene of the crime with last question, because the suspects who blocked reforms do not vanish. They simply change offices, which leads us straight into the smoke-filled chamber where politics rearranges economics. I open this next case and ask whether democracy steers capitalism or whether capitalism quietly grabs the wheel, because the answer determines whose voice shapes the rules that touch every paycheck, ballot, and boardroom. If ownership is widespread, citizens understand their stakes and vote accordingly. Yet when a small fraction holds a towering share, political equality starts to feel ceremonial rather than real in the everyday grind. Modern corporate capitalism lets capital move wherever returns look brightest, loosening ties to towns or nations and widening the distance between shareholder interests and community needs, which tilts conversations long before any vote is cast. That tilt deepens when professional persuaders work the corridors of power, because I tell you lobbying exists to influence legislators, regulators, and judges, and the industry has multiplied in size and spending across recent decades. I remember one political thinker labeling the structure a near paralysis of competing interest groups, a kind of government by veto constraining executives and forcing hard questions to languish while the future speeds ahead. We are right to worry when influence steers votes away from constituents and toward clients. Though sometimes advocacy corrects misinformation and advances public health, education, or environmental protections ordinary families will welcome. Yet powerful industries often press for subsidies, barriers, or privileges that burden everyone else, with energy, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and defense offering familiar examples of lobbying that distorts prices, access, and public budgets. The plot thickens with campaign finance, because elections are expensive and parties cannot cover everything. So lawmakers depend on donors whose generosity may not set votes directly, but still shapes gratitude and future ambitions. After office, the revolving door beckons with salaries far beyond public pay, which adds another incentive to please those who might later hire, bending priorities subtly, even when laws forbid explicit exchanges. One economist described a cycle where tax cuts increase resources for political influence, which then secures further cuts, starves budgets, and drives pressure to shrink services rather than revisit earlier generosity toward the wealthiest households. Lobbying itself looks like marketing with clients, targeting, messaging, and relationship management, and while data provided may be accurate, the framing often tilts decisions toward outcomes that suit the sponsor's interests. Insiders even admit that many requests for contributions originate from elected officials themselves, turning solicitation into a ritual that feels like legal extortion and consumes countless hours better spent governing. A prominent scholar argued that court decisions expanded corporate speech, enabling large sums to shape legislative agendas, not always through obvious bribes, but through earlier adjustments that sidestep straightforward proof of influence. Studies have found links between political activity and corporate performance, including reports of returns on lobbying investment that would dazzle any manager, which explains why the practice persists despite periodic scandals. Corruption complicates markets further in poorer countries, where bribes to officials, military officers, and ministers sell national resources while citizens see little benefit, leaving honest bidders grappling with whether to match illicit offers or withdraw. Several steps can reduce such rot, including outlawing bribery decisively, empowering specialized agencies, rewarding whistleblowers, and following the money into secrecy havens so that stolen wealth cannot hide behind numbered doors. One nation even restricts its firms abroad through a law penalizing foreign corrupt practices, which raised standards for many companies and signaled that winning contracts should not require envelopes passed under tables. Government itself sits at the center of this drama because regulation can prevent harm and balance power, yet excessive or clumsy rules may cost more than they deliver, sparking familiar ideological arguments that never quite end. An influential economist once argued that public agencies and unions can counterbalance concentrated corporate power, creating fairness and safety when markets alone would otherwise tilt toward domination by the largest players. Tax policy tells another story about values, allocating burdens between sales levies and income rates, deciding how steeply to tax the highest earners, and determining what corporations should contribute to shared infrastructures they rely upon daily. Trade choices then shift gains and losses across classes, because low tariffs can lower prices for the poor while displacing domestic work, and the real question becomes how to weigh outcomes over time rather than react to headlines. Periodic reviews of regulations and taxes can prune deadwood and refine designs, ensuring good intentions remain effective rather than rigid, and giving citizens confidence that rules evolve with evidence rather than with slogans. We should also face how a tiny group of extraordinarily wealthy individuals steers elections and policies through donations and advocacy, with well-known financiers illustrating how concentrated fortunes purchase disproportionate attention from leaders. Some propose counterweights that include steeper progressivity, limits on transfers, and higher levies on luxury purchases and estates, aiming to tame outsized influence while leaving room for enterprise and generosity that genuinely benefits the public. The cliffhanger here is simple and unsettling, because unless democratic rules reclaim independence from money's gravity, economic policy will keep reflecting donors first and citizens second, which leads inevitably to short-term thinking that starves tomorrow. I slide a thin folder toward you and whisper that our next mystery is time itself. Because capitalism loves quick wins while the future waits patiently, tapping its foot and wondering why long-term investment keeps getting postponed. The smart way to run any enterprise is to plan for now and later at once, keeping today's revenue targets in sight while building tomorrow's engines. A juggling act that looks elegant only when performed with discipline. Family firms often handle this balance better because they do not report to the stock market every quarter, which lets them plow money into projects that pay off slowly and even tolerate temporary losses when necessary. Public utilities also keep one eye on the horizon because regulators expect them to maintain profitability while expanding capacity for future demand. Creating a structure where long-term investment is not optional, it is part of the job. Publicly traded companies face a harsher clock, since missing earnings expectations invites downgrades, rising borrowing costs, and impatient investors, which tempts managers to smooth results, shift sales between quarters, and prioritize appearances over the messy reality of experimentation. Fast-moving traders compound the pressure by jumping in and out of positions, turning capital into a restless tourist rather than an impatient resident, and leaving fewer funds aligned with the slow work of building capabilities that endure. Even when leaders want to invest, the long-term budget depends on short-term performance, because firms first chase quarterly goals, then fund research, development, and infrastructure with whatever surplus remains, or by raising money through additional shares and bonds. You can see the consequences beneath our feet, where roads, bridges, grids, and water systems graded poorly by engineers signal years of underinvestment, with estimates calling for vast sums just to avoid falling further behind as repairs grow costlier. Other countries seem to build faster and better, according to one global survey, which is why infrastructure headlines sparkle abroad while at home the most reliable investment appears to be digital networks that conveniently charge monthly subscriber fees. A striking example sits in an Asian industrial city that scaled rapidly by pairing infrastructure with education, drawing thousands of firms and dozens of universities, and showing how decisive planning can transform a region's economic prospects within a generation. The uncomfortable question is whether an economy focused on quarterly profits and smaller public budgets can still mobilize enough capital to rebuild what everyone uses daily. Because the benefits of world-class infrastructure compound across households and businesses. One economist warned that an obsession with near-term profits increases financial fragility, as speculative money enters long projects, then exits at the first sign of delay, turning investment cycles into panics while companies scramble to protect short-term numbers. The costs of hesitation are not abstract, since better infrastructure lowers logistics bills, creates jobs, connects regions, and boosts urban productivity and livability, benefits that rarely show up neatly on a quarterly scorecard but reshape competitiveness over decades. Behind the scenes, compensation design tightens the knot, because executives rewarded heavily with stock options naturally focus on share prices, sometimes enjoying gains driven by market tides, while capital projects quietly fail to earn their true cost. Boards need measures that isolate real value created from noise. Otherwise, leaders chase optics rather than outcomes. And the day arrives when dividends wobble, valuations slide, and everyone asks why yesterday's soaring price never translated into durable capacity. Thankfully, there are counter-examples where leaders defended long-term priorities against pressure, choosing customer value, fair pricing, and meaningful experience over quick margin boosts, proving that patient strategy can coexist with growth when vision holds steady under criticism. Still, hope does not replace structure, so we return to the blueprint and consider how to channel more resources into multi-year projects without pretending quarterly accountability must disappear or that investors will suddenly love uncertainty. Part of the answer is candid communication about the pipeline, pairing realistic short-term targets with transparent milestones for long-run initiatives so that missed goals reflect honest learning rather than creative accounting or frantic end-of-quarter theatrics. Another part is financial architecture that rewards staying power, encouraging capital to accompany projects through their awkward adolescence, instead of rewarding exits that leave half-built systems stranded and managers defensive about the next reporting window. Public policy can help by prioritizing essential infrastructure with consistent funding, because bridges, grids, and water systems cannot be rebuilt with leftover budget scraps, and predictable investment multiplies private activity the way good soil encourages new roots. We also need to separate luck from leadership when evaluating executives, distinguishing market-wide lifts from choices that genuinely improve products, processes, and capabilities. So rewards do not encourage superficial maneuvers that flatter charts while starving the workshop. Imagine you and I standing in a grocery aisle jammed with choices, and I whisper that the real puzzle is whether more of everything actually makes people happier, or whether it simply fills shelves without lifting spirits. That question sits at the heart of the chapter, because an economy can grow briskly, raise output per person, and still leave citizens unsure whether life satisfaction has advanced or only the count of transactions has multiplied. A thoughtful scholar even noted that wealth soared in his country while reported happiness fell, suggesting competition preoccupies us, whereas generosity and cooperation may nourish contentment more reliably than another notch on the income ladder. Before we chase clues, I separate two related ideas. Because happiness swings with daily events, while well-being reflects basics like health, education, shelter, skills, and work, allowing steadier measurement than moods buffeted by life's everyday weather. Surveys ask people to rate their usual happiness on simple scales. Then compare those answers with income, age, occupation, beliefs, and background, yielding patterns that complicate the easy assumption that more money automatically equals more smiles. One landmark investigation found little link between national income and reported happiness across countries, and later work showed gains for the very poor and very rich within societies, yet far weaker connections for everyone clustered between those extremes. It also helps to remember that temperament and culture shape outlooks. Since some people inherit sunnier dispositions and different communities approach faith, work, and security in ways that quietly tilt satisfaction long before paychecks are counted. At a household level, joy rises as families approach a comfortable threshold that covers food, clothing, and shelter, then flattens as incomes climb higher because worry recedes as sufficiency, while appetite expands endlessly when comparison becomes the scoreboard. So I shift the lens from feelings to well-being, which rests on clear pillars like nutrition, housing, health, education, skills, and meaningful work, a foundation we can actually track without confusing a tough week with a failing system. Even here, envy and purpose intrude, because status comparisons can sour contentment despite comfort, and a life missing mission, growth, or connection may leave people restless even when necessities are not in question. This is why leaning only on output hides too much, since spreading gains unevenly can raise totals while widening gaps, and recording more goods says nothing about whether their quality improves lives or simply expands inventory. Some increases even crowd out well-being, because more cigarettes, extra litigation, feverish financial churn, redundant brands, and stockpiles of weapons can swell accounts without nourishing safety, trust, or health in any meaningful or durable sense. Other costs hide in the margins as pollution, congestion, and longer hours silently follow growth, reducing leisure and breathing room. Which reminds us that arithmetic without context can flatter results nobody truly experiences as better daily lives. We still must judge outcomes against poverty and inequality, because averages conceal distributions, and a nation can feel prosperous on paper while leaving significant shares of its people short of security, dignity, and a fair chance to advance. Because these limitations are stubborn, I also study an alternative dashboard that a small Himalayan kingdom proposed, one that tracks happiness alongside income by weighing culture, governance, environment, and sustainable development rather than assuming purchases alone define progress. Another analyst suggested mapping wellness across economics, environment, physical health, mental health, workplaces, social cohesion, and civic life, a portrait that helps leaders notice when rising output hides declining contentment or eroding conditions in communities. Sometimes the story moves backward as longer hours, dual incomes pressed by necessity, and shrinking free time leave families strained, while a competitive race to outshine neighbors fuels purchases that satisfy status more than lasting contentment. Scholars warn that chasing material markers as primary goals correlates with anxiety, depression, drug use, and even physical ailments, which does not mean shopping cannot lift moods briefly, only that consumption rarely anchors durable satisfaction by itself. So I highlight alternate routes that many people find sustaining, including devotion to art, culture, and faith, service to others through generosity and volunteering, and a deliberate simplicity that reduces needs and clarifies priorities without glorifying deprivation. Creators and supporters together build the culture that nourishes meaning, because patrons and audiences allow artists, architects, and composers to thrive, and communities diminish when fewer citizens have means or appetite to sustain such work. Likewise, people who help after disasters, share time, and exhibit empathy remind us that prosocial behavior deepens well-being for givers and receivers, strengthening neighborhoods in ways monetary totals never fully capture. When I return to policy, the destination feels clear, because a healthy system should pursue broad happiness and well-being, eliminate poverty, enable potential, and still respect aspiration, with responsible credit supporting purchases without luring households into unsustainable burdens. Affluence in premium goods will still inspire effort, but the promise must be balanced by fair opportunity and protections that prevent extreme concentration from eroding participation, legitimacy, and the hope that today's toil buys tomorrow's genuinely better life. In the end, the case points beyond the scoreboard toward the lives underneath, insisting that prosperity counts only when it enlarges human possibilities, steadies families, protects nature, and leaves us feeling that our busy days add up to something worthy. We reached the final room in our investigation, and I steadied my breath like a detective before a door, asking whether the system we built can truly serve both prosperity and dignity. I wrote this journey to understand the engine running most economies, because capitalism dominates daily life, promises innovation and value, and yet carries faults I believe we can address with grounded, workable remedies that improve lives. The twist is that its troubles do not stand alone like isolated suspects, because each one knows the others, and they conspire as a ring, passing influence from one problem to the next without ever leaving fingerprints. Poverty leans into inequality. Inequality drags demand. Weak demand swells joblessness. Joblessness sparks quarrels over austerity and stimulus. And those fights meet lobbying that whispers in corridors where votes tilt away from regulation or stronger environmental guardrails. That chain reaction explains why touching one lever moves 5 others, because efforts to raise pay floors might also push fragile firms to shutter, trim shifts, or shift sourcing abroad, thinning local payrolls while imports quietly expand their footprint. You can picture a room of lawmakers voting on a single headline issue, tidy and televised, while the web of connections remains offstage. And easier short-term fixes eclipse the patient work that prevents tomorrow's emergency from ambushing everyone. That habit creates a looping soundtrack of urgent problems, because when we avoid deeper repairs, we invite recurring breakdowns, and the short view charges interest that long-term thinking could have saved if taken seriously earlier and sustained steadily. Some people throw up their hands at this complexity and call the case unsolvable, but I refuse despair, because enough thoughtful, skilled, and determined citizens exist to assemble practical answers if we commit to open, sustained collaboration. Every remedy deserves debate, revision, and careful testing, since sketches on paper require craftsmanship in the field, and proposals must respect trade-offs while still aiming past caution toward measurable gains in security, opportunity, and everyday breathing room. I want you to feel this not as policy theater, but as neighborhood life, where fair work, decent pay, reliable schools, and clean air shape mornings, dinners, and dreams more than any statistics scrolling across a news ticker. That is why I keep choosing optimism rooted in action rather than slogans, because realism without hope freezes the hands, while hope without realism floats away, and neither posture fixes a roof before the storm returns. If this sounds like asking the system to grow a conscience, it is more practical than that, since aligned incentives, transparent rules, and thoughtful design can make responsibility the easiest path rather than a noble detour. We have walked past 14 doors together, and each opened onto rooms crowded with causes, consequences, and choices, reminding us that piecemeal repairs without coordination risk tripping wires we never intended to touch while fixing something important nearby. So the method changes from shouting at villains to mapping systems, testing sequences, and learning which order of steps turn strain into momentum. Because a thoughtful cascade can transform feedback loops that previously amplified harm into steadying signals. Think of it like renovating a busy house, where replacing a beam requires bracing other rooms. Because strength comes from coordination more than heroics, and the plan matters as much as the courage to swing the hammer. That is also why single-issue votes feel tidy yet prove treacherous, since the most visible lever often hides three unseen pulleys. And the choice that gratifies tonight can cost opportunities we urgently need next season. When you and I talk about raising incomes, we cannot ignore competitive pressures, import dynamics, and technology's trajectory. And when we talk about safety or sustainability, we must also reckon with jobs, prices, and the budgets households actually navigate. None of this means paralysis. It means choreography, which is simply disciplined movement with purpose. And policy can dance when leaders respect interdependence, measure outcomes honestly, and resist the temptation to declare victory after only the first chorus. I keep faith because I have met leaders who would rather build bridges than barricades, citizens who prefer candor to comfort, and communities that prove, again and again, that collaboration scales better than outrage when stakes climb. The destination is bigger than income statements and election cycles. Because material progress without moral and spiritual well-being leaves rooms furnished and hearts underfed. And I want a system that grows both pantry and purpose together. Call it an economy that earns trust. One where families feel stability spreading through work and neighborhoods, where opportunity rides the bus to every district, and where rules encourage initiative while insisting that success strengthen the commons. You will hear arguments that the challenge is too tangled. Yet history keeps surprising pessimists when determined people choose patience over panic, and incremental wins compound like savings, turning yesterday's experiments into tomorrow's quiet normal. That is why I leave you with a simple image rather than a complicated chart, a light switched on in a hallway that once felt dangerous, revealing doors we can unlock together with steady, neighborly hands. The next steps are not glamorous because they involve tending institutions, refining incentives, and staying with problems longer than headlines do. But that is precisely how systems learn, and how communities become durable rather than merely lucky. If this book has done its job, it has offered starting points, not commandments, because sketches invite improvement, and I would rather join a conversation that builds than deliver a proclamation that hardens before testing. I trust your judgment more than any slogan, and I believe your voice belongs in rooms where rules form, budgets balance, and priorities align. Since democracy works best when citizens practice stewardship rather than consumption alone. So let us leave this room with sleeves rolled, knowing every improvement touches 5 others, and that our measure of success is families steadier, streets kinder, air clearer, and futures brighter than the ones we feared yesterday.